Head.
My father says that he can remember better
For the
in
way
the
back.
past than he can yesterday.
Well, that's true. He's right.
Did you start it already?
Yes.
Oh, well, good. So you met again in Chicago.
Yes, and we went to a nightclub, and Pearl Bailey had
Oh,
just
really?
started, and who's the other man? Anyway, I can't think of it, but it was my first introduction to the type of music that I had never heard, you know.
Yeah,
It was
the
very,
beginning of jazz.
you know, I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah.
Then we went on to Charleston, and George, I think, had just bought a house, I think, or he may have had it before, I don't know.
I remember.
Where was it? St. Albans? No, just out of town anyway.
Maybe Edgewood?
Oh, no, that's later when
Later.
things were a little better.
Better.
Uh,
This is the beginning. Just when he first was working in Charleston.
and just married.
Uh-huh.
And Hallie was working.
She was still working in the
Yeah,
hospital.
she was. So every morning, they would go off together,
Mm-hmm.
and I would be lounging around in bed, and then lunch. Why then, I don't remember too well, but I know we used to eat a lot of hamburger because Hallie was already weight conscious, and she was, hamburger was the thing to eat. And with me, it was great because I enjoyed it, and I got so fat while I was living with them. And not that we had what you call gourmet food, but it was good food. And I just kept gaining weight, and Hallie was trying to lose weight, and it was fun. For her, it was losing weight, but for me, eating the same thing, I was getting fat on it. My arms, now I weigh 100 and, anywheres between 8 and 10 pounds. Well, by the time I left Charleston, I weighed 130,
Oh, my.
32 or 3. I have a picture of me, when I was working with Nomura, and they took pictures of me. My side view of my arm was so big, I don't know, golly.
Eating all-American food, right?
Right,
Oh.
and it was so good,
And so it's probably so bad. The Japanese diet is so
Yeah.
good, lots of fish and
Yeah, I mean,
rice
a little,
and
little,
yeah,
little,
little.
little bit,
uh-huh.
but,
All-American.
Mhm.
So, Ben, let's see. How long did you stay with Hallie and Pop?
I think I was there for 2 years. And I got a job singing, singing in a trio, but this was with a Jewish temple, a Reformed Jew, Jewish temple. And I didn't know all this Jewish words or anything. We just read it. And most of the people who were singing didn't. They were not Jews. There were just the 3 of us. I don't think the woman was Jewish, but anyway, so we just read it by rote, and I sang with them for about 6 months, I think, before I left, and then to kill time, I called the YWCA and I said, is there anything I can do? And this was during the summer, and they needed somebody to help at the camps.
Uh-huh.
So I did that.
And this was for the children?
Yeah, we'd get on the bus and go with the children. And that was a very interesting experience. I got on, and the children all sat in one place, and I sat by myself, and a couple of days, one little girl came and she sat next to me, and we just talked, and I said something about every bead thing being pretty much the same in Japan as it was here. I don't know what it was. And we talked, and she turned around and she says, "She's not so bad." And with that, every morning, they would all fight to sit next to me. And it was very nice.
Yeah.
So that's how I killed time, really.
Right.
I just didn't.
Were you very sad? I mean, you left so much when
Well,
you left Japan.
Not sad. Well, there was so much unhappiness, and I was just glad to get away. Really was. I miss Seiko, of course.
Yeah.
And George and Hallie always gave me enough money to do whatever I wanted to, and all that money I would buy something and send it to Seiko. I don't know if Hallie ever approved of that, but she never said a word.
Wow.
And then we did a lot of sewing. Hallie did a lot of sewing in those days. And so between the two of us, why, I would sew dresses for Seiko. It was always for Seiko.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess I missed her,
Oh,
you know. But life over here was so new to me, everything,
Yeah.
that I was very excited about learning. And then I thought, well, gee, I can't live on George and Hallie. It's not fair to, especially to Hallie. I didn't think it was fair. So I said, well, I'd like to go to New York and see what I could do.
Why New York?
Well, New York was the big place. I felt that,
It was like Tokyo.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And so I went, and when before going, there was one girl that I was teaching already in Charleston, and she was trying to get into show business. And I talked to her, and I found out that she was living in a house. She had her own room, and during the day she was busy taking lessons or auditioning and so on. And I thought, well, I'll try that too. And I went to her place, and there was one room. Oh, it was terrible. It's up on the second floor. In the corner was a basin, you know, and the bed. And that's all.
Was it dirty?
Well,
Bugs?
no, I didn't experience any bugs, but and then I said, well, where's the bathroom? And it was out on the end of the hall,
Oh.
and everybody used it, you know. And I found out that there was an old man who lived in the next room. You could hear him coughing and all that. But anyway, that was it. So, well, I couldn't take this shower. I was afraid. But I did go in and I washed down the wall of the bathroom, thinking that maybe I would, you know, but I didn't. Then I would take a sponge bath. And
Did you ever get?
oh, no. He kept telling people that people would say, you know, curious people would say, well, where's your wife? And, oh, she's in America. She'll be back. And when I heard that, I thought, never would I go back, not to him.
Right.
And, but never would I go back. I had too much pride. But he told a number of people that
He thought you were coming back.
yeah, and but
So when you were living in New York, were you auditioning also?
oh yes, I was auditioning here and there. I made the mistake, of course, not getting a manager, And I didn't know,
Right.
I really didn't know how one went about that. So I would just go in cold, I'd look in the papers and I'd go in and audition and they would ask what's your background, and of course when I said opera comique, soprano, and so forth and so on, that was enough to say, well, what's the matter with this woman anyway. And
Probably there was still a lot of prejudice
I guess so.
against Japanese.
Yeah, probably. But anyway, um, one, but in the meanwhile, I had been looking for jobs, and the Japanese consul, in New York they have the consul, not the embassy,
Right.
and being Kay's sister, and of course they knew my background,
Right.
but there was nothing that they could do musically, but they would call up and they'd say, well, there's a businessman from Tokyo who doesn't speak any English, and he needs an interpreter. Would I take it? And I was glad to take it. It was $10 a day, plus a lunch or something. So I said, oh, sure. Of course, those jobs, the maybe if 4 or 5 days, and then after that, why, I had nothing as far as income was concerned, excepting George's check from time to time. He'd send me a check. No, weekly. Was it weekly or monthly? I don't remember. And anyway, I didn't starve, of course. I always had money. And so in the meanwhile, I would audition, you see. And I'd go to these places, and they'd be young kids, dancing and pretty as they could be. They sang, but of course they was not trained.
Right.
But along I came along, and I would sing authentically, but it wasn't what they were
You're
looking
right.
for.
They were more popular.
Yeah, and they wanted someone who could get up and dance if necessary, and I didn't.
Mhm.
So what was I going to say? Oh, then, gee, what was that? There was a hit show about GI in Japan, and it's so famous, I can't think of the name.
Was it a movie or a regular TV show?
No, it was a show.
That was weekly, like on TV?
No,
Like
theater.
on Broadway.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Goodness. It just
really
little
don't know it.
flickers of the memory,
Yeah.
and I can't.
Well, tell me about the show. Did you audition for it?
Yes, I auditioned for it, and they said, well, there was no part for me, but they would be glad to put a part in
Oh.
so that I could sing in it.
Mhm.
Well, by then, I had sort of started working with Nomura, and that was steady income. Whereas this
Yeah.
show business,
Yeah.
gosh, I can't think of the name. Oh, everybody knows it. This girl who meets a man across the room and they fall in love. What's the name of that song?
Oh, the one South Pacific?
Yeah, South Pacific.
Oh, yeah.
I wish I had the brains enough to join that, because they were
yes.
going to write something where I could come out and sing.
Uh-huh.
But I didn't. I thought, no, I better work at something that at least I had
Steady.
started to work
Yeah.
on. Where this show business is something entirely different.
Yeah.
And so I said no, but I do know a girl. They were looking for a star for that show. And I do know a girl whom I had seen doing something. I can't remember what it was. And told this girl, I got in touch with her somehow. I guess it was the Japan Club or something. Japan America Club. And she went and she auditioned. She got the part. She was the star in that show. And they asked her, she was good enough. She told me about it. And she said, they asked me how I heard about this auditioning. And she told them, and they told her, well, you have a very nice friend. That was the thanks I got.
Right.
But it was
Were
nice.
you using the name Agnes then, or Yoshiko?
Yoshiko. Yeah. But no one knew me, you see, because I had no front runner. I didn't have a manager or anything. But after that, there was a Japanese girl who came over, but she was quite a star in Japan. And she did movies, and her stage name was Rikoran. She made her name in China.
Oh.
And so she had this Rikoran, which is a Chinese name. But then by the time she came back to Japan, she had all this publicity and everything, and she was very famous. So when she came to the United States, they knew who Rikoran was. And so she did quite well. She made a few TV thing, and then she married, and I don't know where she is now.
So you were working for Nomura?
Yes, by then I decided, well, I had to find some steady work. And for some reason, I had a funny feeling that someday Seiko would be joining me. I made no effort. I would just send her presents and write to her and tell her that I loved her and so on. But then Kay, of course, was established in the Japanese Foreign Department, Foreign Office. So Kay had talked to Dick, and I suppose they decided that Seiko was getting pretty out of hand, a very difficult child, I understand. Well, they get that.
She was about 9 or 10, maybe?
Yeah. Oh, well, she was
even more, because
in high school age.
2 years. You were 2 years in Charleston, and then,
Yeah, because when she came, we got her into the high school, and
in New York.
In New York, and she did well enough to graduate, and then she went to Juilliard, and she did 4 years there, and
when did she live with Hallie and Pop?
Oh, when she first came over, we were in New York, and I don't think she was very long with Hallie and George. No, I think that maybe a couple months. I thought it would be good for her to be in an American family.
Right.
And no, she wasn't with Hallie and George, not in years. No, just a
couple
few
of
months or so, yeah.
And that was when you were working in New York?
Oh, yes, I was working all the time, and still, I mean, life was very difficult. And I was just thinking, I had just married Butch when Seiko came over. And Butch had no job. He had no job. And she didn't know about that. I was the only one making a living then. And George's check, of course, stopped coming. And I really worked very hard.
What were you doing in the
Nomura? Well, I was running the Nomura Securities Company in those days. Because there was only this one manager, one man who came over to, this also from the embassy, the consulate. He came over and, this is a long story. Right after the war and right after I had moved to New York, the consul called and I said, you know, there are two gentlemen from the stockbrokers, Nomura, and they need somebody. Would I take over?
Translator,
Yeah.
secretary type?
No typing, but this was a translator and interpreter, and just to accompany them and steer them in the right direction. So I got to know New York, I mean the Wall Street section pretty well. And see, there was these two men, and how long were they in New York? I think I have worked for them for at least 2 weeks or so. And we would meet in one of the offices that they had more or less, Morgan Stanley was the name of this outfit, and they were friends before the war. And they lent us their little cubby hole with a telephone. And that's where I used to go meet them at 9 o'clock, and I would make all the telephone calls for the day, and we'd go off. And yes, and then these men, of course, were important men, and the security firms where we visited were very curious to know how things were in Japan and what the possibilities were. And they knew about Nomura's reputation. And so they were very interested, but they would invite these two men for lunch, and I would be left out in the cold.
Oh, no.
And they never thought of inviting me. But they understood enough technical words so they could more or less carry on a conversation. So I would go around eating a hot dog here or something, and if I had time, I would go to the church chapel. They have an organist would be there and have beautiful music. And when the time came, then I would go and meet these. Really, it was not an easy life. And then I'd take them back to the hotel. And they were allowed in those days, $12 or $13 a day for one man each. Well, they were staying. They had to make a good impression, so they stayed at the Waldorf.
So how did you meet Butch?
Butch was, let's see, I was in a Japanese food. This was shortly after I arrived in New York, and I was staying at this horrible place. It was $5 a week.
Oh, my.
So you could see, you don't get very much for that. And the landlady was, she was tough, you know.
Yeah.
Sitting around all day and smoking, and I remember she was good-hearted, you know. And she found out that I was getting a check, you know, and so on. She said, I wouldn't leave your money in your room, or do something with it. And I was being very careful then, of course, but I didn't stay there very long for the simple reason that it was so terrible. And it was on 68th Street between Amsterdam and Broadway. I remember that. Yeah, a rough joint. But later on, it developed very nicely because the Juilliard School built just a block away, and that music section is right there. So I imagine she charges more than $5 now if she's alive. But anyway, in those days it was not very nice. But I didn't realize that I was living in a poor quarter. I didn't know any better, you know.
And you had the friend who...
Yes, this friend. She lived in one of the rooms upstairs.
Yeah. So you were telling me how you met Butch
And
in
yes,
a
so
Japanese
there was a
restaurant?
Japanese food store not too far away. And of course, I was a little homesick, and I would go there and buy some dishes and stand around talking. And they said, "Oh, well, would you like to? There's a Japanese gym." Oh, what's that there? Huh. Or was that at a Japanese restaurant they told me about? I think it must have been in this Suehiro restaurant. And I went to the restaurant, and the old lady there who owned it was not old, but she was very nice, and she liked Butch a lot. And but he was a gentleman, and so he, they introduced, she introduced the Butch to me, and we hit it off very nicely. And then at that time, I was still undecided about what to do with myself. And in the meanwhile, Dick would send over brochures of his business, like selling sewing machines and things like that. So I thought, well, I'll I'll do what I can. So I went into between auditions and other little things that I was doing just to make a little extra cash. Um, see, I would take these things and I would go into there's always a section, machineries and clothing and so on, and I would go in and talk to some of these people who owned these, who were selling or importing things. Oh yes, and Dick said that I should see certain people and so on. So I went into that section, part of the New York, which is around the 23rd Street, 32nd, 23rd, right off Broadway. And I would get all dressed up and I would go in, and I sold 300 sewing machines.
Oh. Did you get a commission?
I thought I would,
Ah,
but I didn't.
Dick didn't give it to you?
No, because I, I, sh- I s- told them about it, and I felt that, well, I better tell them that I got this. This man and his wife, they were very thoughtful, very nice, and they said, "This is your commission." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you," and it was $100. And oh yeah, and I had invited, Japanese style, I invited them, the two of them, to the Suehiro for dinner. So that came out of my pocket, you see. And so anyway, they handed me $100, and I was glad to have it. But Dick wanted me to send the money back. He said because they needed money in Japan. So by then I was so fed up, I thought, okay, you'll have your $100, and I'm through.
So how did you get the divorce?
Charleston.
Oh.
Well, I think George and Hallie were waiting for me to really. They never said anything, and finally I thought, well, I've taken enough, and I think I better really get get free of all that. So that's what happened. I sued, and the lawyer at the time told me, you're the ones that's suing and leaving, so you're not entitled to
Oh,
anything.
I see, yeah.
And your daughter, you're not privileged to see her or whatever. And I said, no, I understand that. So, but for some reason, I had a feeling that Seiko was going to come and join me.
Mhm.
I wish he had waited a little bit more, because then we would have been more or less established. But Butch, you see, didn't have a job even
What
when
was his
Seiko.
training?
What?
What was his training? What had he done prior to that?
He had um, he had a Jewish partner, and they were importing things from
Mm.
Japan,
I see.
and they obviously did very well. And this Jewish man was very dependent on Butch.
Mhm.
And at the time that Butch was courting me, I noticed he was always very well dressed. And he had a little dog that he loved very much. I know along at a certain time, he would look at his watch and then he'd have to go home. And at first I didn't understand that, and he said, he's got a dog he has to take care of. And so then, anyway, things went on, and I got my job with Nomura.
Mhm.
And little by little, the Japanese companies were coming back, and Nomura had a number of subsidiary companies. And Nomura Trading Company was thinking of sending a man over. And my boss said, do you think your husband would like to work for?
Oh,
And
I
I said,
see.
oh my goodness, really? And
How long were you married then that he was unemployed?
Oh, I guess about 2 years.
That's a long
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
isn't it?
Right, yes, he was, but I said nothing, he said nothing, but he would go out to look for a job. And I know after Seiko arrived, why, every morning at a certain time, he'd get dressed, go out. And Seiko didn't know the difference. She just thought he was going out
For work.
For work.
Yeah, and he was really going out to look for
Yeah,
work.
look for work.
Yeah.
And of course, he was already, not very young.
How old was he?
Well, he was about 13 or 14 years older than I.
Oh.
So, it's hard for a
Yeah.
gentleman. He was really quite a gentleman, and he looked well, and he took care of his clothes and so
Mhm.
on. So,
And where did you live? In another apartment?
yeah. Then, from this terrible place,
Mm-hmm.
I moved into another place, which was on the third floor walk up. But I've forgotten what, somebody said something who visited me. Was it my uncle? And he said, it's a shame that you're living in a place like this. You shouldn't live in a place like this. And also Butch, too, he was telling me, too, that, he had an idea of what my background was and all that, and he said, it would be terrible to be caught in a place like this. Okay. So then I started looking, and I found another rooming on the third floor. I was young, I could climb up the stairs, climb down. I lived there, and then I think by then Butch and I were living together.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we had no drapes, so I had some old sheets that I'd made tie-dye, made a little design, and then we saved all of our coffee grounds and tea grounds and made dye out of that.
Oh, I see.
And I dyed the sheets. And then we hung them all. It looked very nice. And I had a piano, a grand piano, mind you, in the corner.
How did you get that? How did you get that?
Oh, I don't know. I bought it. I don't even remember buying it, but I did. I owned a grand piano,
Huh.
a small one.
Yeah, and that was when Seiko was living with you and she played?
No, Seiko, by the time Seiko was coming, Butch and I decided, well, we better find a better place, and besides, Butch was
That was
working.
when he was working for the trading company.
Yeah. So we could afford it. How we paid $90 rent. And we had 2 bedrooms and 1 bedroom for I guess it was a servant's quarter, and a shower, a bathtub with a shower, That was for them, and the kitchen, of course, and a large dining room and a large living room.
Oh, and that was in New York too?
Yeah. And so before Seiko came, I rented one of the bedrooms, and I saved the other bedroom for Seiko. And the living room, the dining room, we had little use for it, so we used that as our sleeping quarter, Butch and I. And we ate in the kitchen. The kitchen was large enough so we could eat in the kitchen. And that's how we managed. I mean, they had this rumor, you see, from a Japanese company. And Seiko had the 1 bedroom. So I don't think she realizes how we managed in those days, but we did. And we never ever, of course she knew that we had this rumor, and I don't think she liked him. And by then, little by little, we were getting more comfortable, and we bought a car, a used car, so that over the weekend, we would make a picnic lunch and go off someplace.
Did she get along all right with Butch?
Oh, yes. Butch was, at least I think so, and he was so good to her. By then we lived on 100 and, I can't remember, but it was just across the street from the Episcopalian church, what they used to call the country church, but it was a whole block. It was a cemetery, but beautifully kept, just like a park. And we had, our apartment was overlooking that park. And then she would go to Juilliard by subway, and it was very nearby, and then come home, and then sometimes she wanted to take judo lessons. That was self-protection, which was fine. So she took that. Of course, Butch sent her all her school thing, and so she always had no money of her own. So she would take judo lessons, she'd take German lessons, and she had piano lessons. I guess that's about it. And but she would sometimes come home late, and Butch would go out and wait for her at the subway, where the subway would stop, and he'd be right there
waiting for her
to come back. And many times during the day when she got home earlier and he happened to be home, he'd be right there, you see. So
they had a pretty good relationship.
I hope so, yes.
Yeah.
He was a very gentle person, very quiet. I could do no wrong,
Oh, that's nice.
But we were always not very wealthy, so we worked very hard.
And you continued to work?
Oh, yes. I continued to work until I was 62. Oh, yeah. And then, of course, he retired at 64, I think. But he had to, or 65, was it?
Did he have poor health?
No.
Oh, they
Social
just
Security,
required,
yeah,
retirement
required,
age, I see.
Usually, the Japanese companies like the people to retire at 55.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But they needed him, and he knew enough about business, things. By then, of course, Nomura had been pretty well established. My company was established, and so was the trading company, and they really didn't need him. And so he retired, and I don't think the company treated him very well, but what the heck, beggars you can't
Yes.
tell people. But Nomura has been very good to me, and not as good as they the boss who has now retired, but the young man who at that time he was just a young man. He was not even married, and every time he went to Wharton School, business school in Philadelphia or someplace, I think. And whenever he came into New York, why, he would call up and he'd say, "I'm here." And I'd say, "Well, did you have your dinner, or did you have, and if he didn't, I'd say, "Well, come over and have dinner with us." So he was like a sort of a relative, We liked it very much. So all the time that he reached the position of being director, one of the managing directors of Nomura, I expected him to go right up to the top, but he didn't. And I just had a notice from him that he was now executive vice president of, I'm sure it's part of Nomura. That's how they take care of their people, And so I had written to him, and I said, "I'd like to know what your work is now. I mean, the title sounds fine, but and so on. But he's doing fine, I'm sure."
And so you lived in New York all that time?
Yeah.
And you had another apartment?
Yes. Well, this last apartment that when Seiko came was our last apartment.
Oh, so you stayed there for a long time?
Yes. Oh, yes.
But after a while, the roomer left.
Oh, yeah, about 11 or 12 years.
Yeah.
Really nice.
So then Seiko
graduated, got
then
her degrees, and then
she went back to Japan.
Yeah, well, we decided.
Is it time to go?
No, but it's time for lunch.
Yes,
I don't
you're
want...
right. It is time for lunch.
But go ahead and finish that.
Well, I
thought,
think
for
it
heaven's
was,
sake.
yes. It was time. I felt that, well, I've done as much as I could for her. And if she wanted to go in for a professional life, she'd have to come back and study some more. When you go to a music school, you learn a little of this and a little of that, lots of things. And that's fine. But if she wanted to sing or something, she'd have to drop all this other stuff and concentrate on just one thing. And so I said, "Look, it's time that you saw your father, and then make up your mind what you want." And of course she said, "Oh, I want to sing, I want to sing." In the meanwhile, unfortunately, she had worked so hard, I'm sure, that she had a slight nervous breakdown. Oh, that was dreadful. It was terrible. Well, the minister of the church said, "Well, why don't we, he saw how she was behaving. To me, she was just clinging and clinging and clinging, day and night." And he said, "You're going to get sick. We'll have to do something about that." And so he made arrangements for her to be at this hospital. And she was there 3 or 4 months, I guess. 3 months, I guess. And she did very well. She came out of it. And so that's when I thought, well, her life has been sort of mixed up. And it might be a good idea to be with her father for a while. And I shouldn't have done it, but I did, because I thought that would be good for her.
Yeah.
And,
So hard to know
yeah.
from
But
one
she-
side how it is from the other side.
But she wrote back and said that, but I think by then she had met this boy, you know, her husband.
Yes.
I think, I'm not sure. But she said, oh, you know, there are lots of germs in Japan and all that, but she didn't mind the germs. That she thought she liked to stay in Japan. And then shortly after, she got married, so I
Right.
think that was the whole thing.
Well, we will stop for lunch.
Yes, I think we've reached pretty much the end of the tale.